This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board.
And nice snow outside. And it's light and fluffy and kind of interesting and reminds us that winter is around. Last night was a celebration of Bill Taylor's 70th birthday, and rather wonderful. I've known Bill for a long, long time. He was in charge of Red Herring for quite a while, and he's had a lot to do with the foundation of WEFT. He and Bill Thomas and others got together very early on. They were broadcasting from the old IGA store in Urbana, which became a community television center. Urbana City decided in its wisdom that it should have a public television division, and they occupied the old IGA store opposite the high school on Vine Street in Urbana. And that's a while ago, and WEFT broadcast from there for a while. They also broadcast from the Oddfellows building in downtown Champaign, which became part of the corner of Neal and University, which is now the Bank of Illinois, which is now the Busey Bank, and for a while was First National Bank. So there were a block of buildings on the corner that included the Oddfellows building. I think Mr. Krause used to own it, and it had business on the first floor, which is not unusual for an Oddfellows building, and then the second floor was the Rebecca's, and the third floor was Secret Society of the Oddfellows, and you had a big open floor, but this is where the establishment would meet. And if you were a member, this was part insurance and part camaraderie. If you were likely to be kicked in the stomach with a horse or plowed over with a piece of farm equipment, and you had a large family, because in those days you had large families, the people who were the Oddfellows, the members of the society, would look after your family, and be it in a small community or large. But there was quite a lot of ritual that went with that, and some of it was preserved for the future. I actually have the glyph was on the front of that building when it was taken down for a Busey parking lot, and it has the eye of God that looks over a crook and a sword, and the crook was so that you could corral a sheep or an animal and bring it to you so you could work with it. The sword was so that you could protect that animal. But there was a tent with the flap open where you were invited in, and there was a bundle of sticks represented as in a sort of a stylistic manner, and that was sometimes used as a friendship bond, but sometimes used if it was on your door and you'd been drinking and you hadn't been looking after your family. That was a warning that you should straighten out. And so this glyph was part of the structure of that building, and we have it next door. I hope it will to go to some sort of historic situation, but so it goes back to where we were meeting in that building to figure out where WEFT might be. At that time, we had come to Champaign, we being Heartland Pathways and Educational Resources in Environmental Science. We had occupied 2 of 4 buildings that were empty on Market Street. This was the era when you had a dead central business district. Sears and Penny's and all sorts of shops had moved to the new mall north of town. The Flatiron building over on Neal Street had been taken down in an attempt to try and preserve the dignity of having Sears in the town, but the buildings were not in good shape. Some of them were taken down mainly to provide a parking lot for a new Parkland College. And so I remember meeting with Mark Rubel and others that were working on the occupancy of these 4 buildings. And eventually Bill Taylor had a lot to do with the purchase of one of these buildings. The Grubb family used to own them. The Grubb family came here in about 1956, and they gradually expanded a complex of 8 buildings that were sort of niched together. You have to imagine that on Market Street and Walnut Street there were 2 parallel sets of buildings, about 8 of them, about 100 feet long, with a 40-foot alleyway behind. This was still horse era, but that block had been burned several times, and so the new buildings were, I would say about the turn of the century, were going in as brick, and but then the alleyway was closed and given to the back end of each building, and that allowed those buildings to be coalesced, and gradually the Grubb family, which were engravers. So in those days you worked with letterpresses, very heavy letterpresses. We still have one of them upstairs. It weighs 55,000 pounds. And you can't bring that sort of letterpress in or out easily. I think it's a 1946 Rolls-Royce letterpress, which was the one we have is just a proof press. If you were working with medical illustration, for instance, it was very important that a pimple or a operation should be very accurate, and so this proofed, and then journeymen would have little instruments that could scratch the copper plates and make it accurate. So these were sort of editorial devices that were rather important, and the Grubb family was providing these materials around the state and perhaps nationally too. It was before there was a rotograph era. So you had a linotype. You could walk down Market Street and there was a linotype. Click, 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 and you would form letters, and then journeymen would put the letters together as lead blocks, and that could be used for printing direct. But if you were servicing newspapers in Rossville or other places, you made a paper mache copy of that page, and the paper mache version would be sent out, and at the other end, the newspaper that was serviced would have the ability to make another paper mache copy, and then pour lead into it, and then print from that lead. Later came rotogravure, and eventually everything got computerized, so the buildings got sold, and we occupied 2, bought 1, and Weft bought 1. We at one stage had put in a proposal to the Kresge Foundation to have these 4 buildings as non-profit buildings, and a response from the Kresge Foundation was that an excellent idea, but you guys don't have any collateral, so we can't really fund you without knowing that you have enough to be able to do what you're saying you're going to do. So that didn't happen, but we did occupy this area, and Bill had a lot to do with inexpensively creating a building that would be a broadcast building. He would go over to Galesburg, and there was an agency, NAID, I think it was called, and I forget what the acronym was for, but you could, companies that were closing out would deposit their leftovers there. Sometimes you could buy a whole lot, and the lot would include exactly what you want, like it might be a broadcast facility or windows or chairs. It was you might have to buy the lot in order to get the piece that you wanted. But Bill would go over there and get those, and so I feel that Weft owes Bill and Bill Thomas, and I'm forgetting whoever else that came to start this. One of them is comes back occasionally to run contra dancing, and so he's still around. And so let me say something about the camaraderie of this. A lot of things don't happen at the state level. They don't happen at the national level. They where people get together. And one of the things is Bill and family, Janet and his 2 daughters, and Ben and others, they get together and create a little get-together on Tuesdays or Wednesdays, whatever they choose, on a vacant lot on Oregon Street. And this takes in people from age nothing to age 90. It's and people mix and exchange ideas, and that's tremendously valuable. I'll talk a little later about a meeting that David and I went to in Danville, and that had some of the same elements of how we get together for a Kickapoo trail, or how we get together in the Arcola area for a trail that we may lose. I talked to Bill's brother and sister-in-law. They came in from Duluth, and that takes you to Minnesota and Lake Superior. And we've had a person that's been taking down a big shipping elevator that's on the lake, and that person took down the Staley elevator by hand and took the pieces to Wisconsin to recycle the wood. Almost no knots in it. Some of the beams are huge, never to be gotten again. And so the person that did that was from the Chicago area, but they also had their foot in Duluth, where they were taking down this huge shipping elevator. The elevators have changed style. They went to square concrete, and then they went to round concrete, and it's much stronger. And you also have to worry about elevators falling over if they're in glacial soil. But so way north, and Bill's brother was a school counselor, and his wife works with churches. It's just interesting to see the extended family, to meet with high school kids that used to work with our seed. The Meyer and Adrian from Bill's family, and Ewan Robinson and Johnny Marlin. These were Mimi Larson. These are all people who were in high school, doing active things in high school, objecting to too much sugar, objecting to the loss of biodiversity. They had a teacher, Tracy Satterthwaite, who encouraged this sort of thinking, and those people have gone on to do interesting things. So, Ewan has been in Africa working with ecosystems or social systems there, has come back to London for a while, or England, and then has come back to Ithaca, where he's doing a PhD. I didn't talk to him for more than a moment, but his parents are here. His brother works with the Spurlock Museum. All these little interactions make places like WEFT operate or operate in a very friendly manner. And so talking to people that have watched for years, and in one situation I got told that the bids that went out on Friday for the Kickapoo Trail came in very high, which was disappointing, but I found it out there for the first time. I hadn't read the newspaper article. And Meyer had put together a fantastic amount of what's happened with this group of people. And it's a little bit awkward for Bill. It almost looked like a funeral, a memorial service, but it was covering years of interaction, and Maya does take a lot of pictures and works with the co-op, which used to be Strawberry Fields way back, and it used to take in glass and recycle. There was a household interested in pollution solution. It used to be housewives interested in pollution solution, and then Mayor McCollum got into the act before he was mayor, and so it became households interested in pollution solution. And so Johnny Marlin tells me that his mother is probably going to run for mayor. All these things interact in a wonderful way, and I want to make sure that you understand that, and that you belong to some of these groups. And sometimes you have to put your head out there and actually say something that might be embarrassing later, but it might be from the bottom of your heart, or it might be for your passion. But we need to keep these things going, and we need to keep that sort of atmosphere going at WEFT. We've lost quite a little bit of federal support money, and so it's hard for WEF to maintain itself. But people like Bill and family and extended family are very supportive of what WEFT does, even if they don't appear lately. because they've gone on to other things. Bill has done a lot of with putting up radio towers in other places, Latin America, Honduras, or whatever, Guatemala, those places, and that leads to another interaction where you have people who have Latino backgrounds. It's a wonderful interaction, and that is how some things work. Not everything works that way. If we're looking at rail trails, for instance, we lost a 200-mile rail trail potential across the northern part of Missouri, but when a similar rail trail from St. Louis to Kansas City closed out, then one person stepped up and bought the whole railroad bed. And so we're rather dependent on those people who have made it, like Gates and others that have made it and decided to do something with their money. And so, but that is a whole spectrum of how someone that has the potential to do that can relate to a bunch of people who are in their 40s and 50s and perhaps beginning to make it, and then a whole bunch of younger people who have perhaps a changed idea about taking out all your ecosystem or utilizing the Amazon. They have a different idea, and they can do a kickstart and perhaps provide you with $5 here and $5 there. But that often won't quite make it to a major statewide trail or national trail. So you need the federal government, you need the state government, and you need the young folk that helped push this into action. So that's a little of my rant. It was a show that was in a part of Main Street, Urbana, which has been near to some in the 1800s, perhaps 1870s, I think. Flatiron building on the west end of Main Street, Urbana, was burned, but there was that little part of that street was rather active and has now become excuse me, has now become a center for a pizza parlor and an art gallery, and a one storefront has been taken out and has become a different sort of storefront. You can walk through it. There's a shipping container there that you can store things in. There's a shipping container type situation where you can go and sit in the open, and so that is happening, and even the boneyard is being considered for remodeling. That on Broadway is being remodeled nicely, and some of the rest of the boneyard might be developed. This is somewhat different from Champaign, a different philosophy. One town is more the older town of Urbana, and Champaign was the more commercial town, which came along with the railroad coming through west of Urbana, probably because the moranic situation, the geology was suitable, probably a little bit because towns didn't always like to have steam engines coming through their territory, so they put them a little to outside of town, and then that site became a new town, and so not unusual to have twin cities like that. So that's my encouragement is for you to get out there and find out about what's happening in your territory. Go to a city meeting every once in a while. If not, just turn the television on and listen. Urbana Public Television has been doing a lot to have us transmit some of these messages that we have, and we now have something like 75 one-hour messages on YouTube that you can get access to at any time, at any place, and we hope that in there's some information. It may be a little repetitive sometimes because we're dealing with the same sort of a situation and we're reporting on it from time to time. But you can talk to each other and you find out information about each other. You can perhaps take out on a hug or two, or you you might have moved to Vermont and found it's a little different, a little bit more conservative, and you might want to come back to Champaign where your friends and relatives were more interactive. This group of people has just had a weekend of dancing, contra dancing in the Union, and so there's a physical element to this sort of thing. A musical element to this too, and that spills over into places like WEFT. Okay, in our own neck of the woods, we just have a new bar. It's on the corner of Main and Walnut. It's called Barrel House 34. It was a building that's been unoccupied for a long time, and it just opened this week, and we wish them well. Carlos Nito and his brother and his wife own the bar, and I think they'll do well. Champaign has now a lot of restaurants and bars, and people enjoy them, and you'd be amazed at the camaraderie that goes on in those bars along with the music. So we encourage this. Go back to the Kickapoo Trail. David and I went to this meeting in Vermilion County, and David might like to say something. He was seeing the trail potential for the first time, and he may have a comment or two.
Sure. It was a very interesting evening. Basically, it was put together by the folks from the Vermilion end of the Kickapoo Trail, even though we had found out that the Kickapoo Trail the Vermilion end of the trail has been put on hold for the time being due to budget shortages in the state. They still hosted this and brought in the folks from several other places, including the Champaign County Forest Preserve, who presented on the one that's supposed to be going forward now. At our end, already starting in May or something like that, and the engineers who are going to be the overseers. These aren't the overseers who, in theory, would be out there with the big machinery and putting all that down. As Dave alluded to before, that's actually kind of up in the air right now because no one came in with a low enough bid for the amount of money that the state already has allocated to pay them to put in the first part of the Champaign County end of the trail. But it was still interesting. We didn't know any of this at the time of this meeting. And everyone had interesting presentations talking about how many person hours it was going to take. From the original description, it sounded like, oh, well, heck, there will be enough hours in the work week that this thing will be done well before, fall of this year, certainly before the end of this season. And it turns out, no, the way the engineers actually measure this, you always figure at most you can count on having 4 work days out of 5 between days off due to holidays and days off due to not being able to work because of inclement weather. So the soonest they realistically think that this could be done would be by sometime in the spring of next year. That's a little bit of a letdown. It's not like you can be riding the first part of the trail while they're still finishing up the second part. So this pretty much means that none of it's going to be available until next year. The other thing that was sort of disappointing to me that I kind of knew before I walked in the door because Dave pointed it out in the description for people who were making a bid on it. Many of the trails that I've ridden are nice, solid ground. They're either concrete or they're asphalt. So you're either riding on something that's basically a sidewalk, or you're riding on something that's almost like a street. It's basically just a bunch of tar that's been, smushed down, and it's nice. If you're going to fall off your bike, you can't beat falling onto asphalt. Well, let's put it. A friend has told me this, and this is the way I know of it. And it turns out that this trail is not going to be like that. This trail, in fact, is going to be, if you picture the country roads around here, it's called oil and chip. These trails, the bike trail here, won't be quite that rough. Believe me, from personal experience, I know from trying to ride on local country roads when they've just been oiled and chipped. You just turn your bike around, go back to the last road that you were on, and go down another mile and hope they didn't do it there also. It's large enough chunks of limestone that if you've got narrow tires on your bike, you just stay away and you leave it to the people who are on hybrid bikes and mountain bikes and things like that to challenge it. So that means even when this thing is completed, you won't see me out there with my nice, trusty, Italian racing bike, blah, blah, the way they're called. Used to call them 10 speeds and things like that. So that was disappointing to me. I talked with John Hasselbring, who's the planning director from the Champaign County Forest Preserves. He's the one who broke the bad news to me. And during the intermission, during the break, he walked over and he said, "Dave, I don't think you actually want this to start out the way you're describing it, as concrete or especially maybe as asphalt." He said, in their doing due diligence and finding out what trails look like, in the cases where people put down the ballast for the trail, get everything ready to go, and then put something nice and solid down, guess what? You get so much settling in this area because of the glacial till that's underneath everything. Within years, you've got to go back and fix it all up anyway. So he said, maybe we'll get there someday. Maybe one of these, 5 years down the road or whatever, we will be past the point of figuring that there'll be much more settling. And then if we've got the budget for it, we can go and make it nice and pretty for you, Dave. Pat on the head. He didn't quite go there, but yeah, for you people who need things, nice and neat for yourselves. But in the meantime, it'll be open for people to just go walking. They certainly don't care about the stuff, which again will be fairly fine oil and chip. This won't be like walking on the stuff that you might find along the side of a street that's just been put in, the bits of gravel and things that are just laying there. And then certainly people who have fatter tires on their bicycles will be able to use this trail. They did point out that at this point they're not making any arrangements for two things. One, horses. I've been on plenty of trails where they say, P.S., equestrian traffic also allowed here. And the other thing is there are no provisions specifically for parking spaces. There are enough parking areas on the roads adjacent to where this trail will come out from, one county road to the next, or from on Main Street, for example, in Champaign, to where it comes out when it gets to St. Joseph eventually. There are enough parking spaces. They figure they don't need to set aside any land in between specifically for people to park their cars. That's most of what I took from it. Again, it's all largely from the bicycle end of things. And if it's good enough for a bicycle to ride on it, it's certainly going to be good enough for somebody who just wants to get out there and walk a few miles for exercise.
They do put some calcium chloride in the mix. Some mixes are harder than others, and some of them are all weather. Chip limestone tends to take a little of the moisture of rain, but it's a sort of all-weather trail, and even if not, it's a trail that is available on most fine days. The bidding will probably go on again, or they will modify the plan. At the moment, you could put a bush hog along the ballast where the trees have not grown very much, and you could have the trail available to at least hiking use, but then that's not how federal money and state money goes. You usually have to have a very detailed plan. It has to be not libelous. For instance, if you roll over a bulldozer or something like that, there needs to be a plan for that. Whereas if you just go in with a forest preserve bush hog and move along the trail that has some looseness to it. And that's one of the difficulties with non-profit organization, is that they don't always have the money to cover things like liability or special engineering needs. It needs that balance between the federal government, the state government, and the railroads that may want to come back in. This is our interim trail use agreement with the federal government, mainly designed to preserve the railroad bed for future use. So you don't want to destroy it as a potential railroad. The meeting was structured mainly to invite adjacent owners to come in and the public to come in and know what is the intent. Not only that, but to have people add their comments. This was a fairly quiet meeting. There weren't a lot of people asking questions, and I think that the organizers had thought that they would get more questions. Let's tell you what the structure of the meeting was. First, there was George Velovic, who was a state organization at the state level. The money for this sort of rail-banked trail comes basically from the federal government. They quiet the title so you don't have to go around a reversionary clause, and they save the bridges, which are very, very expensive if you have to replace. One bridge in across the Vermilion River will use about $2 million to put a bridge on top of a bridge. Yeah. So the state is involved. The state money is not as large as the federal money to preserve the railroad bed. So eventually I think the state will take the federal money and provide some state money. But at the moment, we're still arguing about budgets at the state level, and this is part of that. So that particular upgrade of that bridge so that you could ride a bicycle across it was not bid on Friday. The Champaign end was bid on Friday, and the bids came in quite high. The area involved is from Main Street, parallel to 150, goes across 130, which runs outside of Walmart. And the bids came in like 2,700 to 2,742,000, 3 million, 2 million, nearly 3 million, over 3 million, and another one over 3 million. So that is more than was anticipated by the trail developing people. So George Belovic is on that end of the state's consideration, where the money comes from the Federal Department of Transportation, called Surface Transportation, and this is an alternate form of transportation. It's where you're hiking and biking and developing the small communities in between. So George talked about statewide trails. There are a lot of these trails in the Chicago area, and there's a lot of trails across the northern part of the state. And they go to Quad Cities and they parallel the Hennepin Canal. And then there are other trails. There's a Tunnel Hill Trail in southern Illinois. And there are trails that are not necessarily rail trails like the trail that follows the Mississippi. And the state has not got a lot of trails, basically because the glacial till is very useful for farmland. And other states have the trail advantage that they're not as rich in soils, and like Wisconsin has a lot of these trails. Minnesota has a lot. I think you can actually ride a trail almost from Minneapolis to Duluth. Iowa has trails. They don't have a lot of forest because Iowa doesn't really have a Shawnee forest. It is mainly prairie, so they're specialists in prairie. So George Belovic was a representative of the Department of Natural Resources, because this money goes from the federal government transportation to state Department of Transportation, and they take out part of what they want to do with trails and rails preservation, and then money moves on to the Department of Natural Resources, and again the overall administration takes out some for the functions that are associated with the State Department of Natural Resources. And then there's a division within the Department of Natural Resources, which is bikeways, hikeways, and greenways. And that's where George Belovic comes from. So he spoke to that. And then both the groups that own the rail bed now between Urbana and Kickapoo State Park, which is a resource at the end of this area, which is strip mining mainly, but very wonderful area that provides you with ponds that might be 15 years old, 20 years old, 50 years old, 100 years old, and give you an idea of the biology. The rivers run through it. An interesting area that is not we don't have in Champaign County, so we're dependent on going to Vermilion County for some of our biology and history. There's coal there, so there's underground geology that's different, and there are people that came to work mines that came from Kentucky and Tennessee. They have an interesting sociological background, and just interesting things happen in Vermilion County. And it also spreads into Indiana. So you cross the border and find interesting things in Indiana too. Well, George spoke. Then the owners, Champaign County Forest Preserve, the Vermilion County Conservation District, Ken Consis in Vermilion County, Dan Olson, CEO for the Forest Preserve, spoke. And they tried to outline what they were going to do. And that was the purpose of the meeting, was to have people to understand what we're thinking about, but more than that, to beg people to come to meetings and put their oar in the water and actually explain what they might want to do with this. That means that they have to become somewhat educated about the corridor. For Heartland Pathways that took out the interim trail use agreement, I was asked to speak for a little while on that, and our concern has been the lack of biological ecosystem. So we were wanting to buy the land not just for a trail, but for the prairie soil. We lost some of it to recent road widening, but there is another group that has been asked to supervise the construction engineers. So when you go in with a bulldozer and cranes and all the equipment that comes with one of those bids for $3 million, you you have traditional plans that are very well read. It's just, if you're going to move soil 4 inches, it's there in the plan. If you're putting in a culvert, it's actually there. So these are construction engineers that know how to read plans and know how to get the job done. When it comes to the ecosystem, you have to be very careful that the construction is done so that you don't destroy the ecosystem. There's a thing called a construction easement. That means that you can, if you're going to put a grader on the territory, you can park in this place while you're doing the work. After the work is finished, that construction easement goes. There are erosion controls where you put up a plastic fence to prevent soil from washing down the drains. And actually, if you go to St. Joe in the recent rains, you'll see water everywhere, and some of that water is very brown and it's taking out soil. So erosion control is important. But the prairie is there, and the Forest Preserve and the Vermilion County Conservation District, they're both very aware that this is part of the purpose of this corridor is to preserve the soil. So they have a group called the Farnsworth Group. And this is a group of engineers that does nothing else other than supervise, so that they can watch construction to see that it's not destroying prairie, and they watch the planting of new plants to see that it's done correctly, but it's done with sensitivity. So this corridor has grown to trees, too largely. Very recent growth of trees, and that is because the railroads, when they came in, drained the area, and most trees like moisture, but they don't like to be sitting in moisture. The only tree that we had on the prairie mainly was a very wet prairie, a very swampy prairie, and cottonwoods can handle that. And if there's drought, their roots are deep enough that they can go down into the aquifer underneath. So we didn't have a lot of trees, but we have to deal with the fact that the trees are treated fondly by people, because you can hug a tree, but you can't hug a prairie. And we're looking for the prairie ecosystem because it's down to 0.01%. This used to be 2/3 of the state was prairie, and we have very little left. It's almost an extinct ecosystem locally. Now, you can go out to Denver and get a shortgrass prairie, and you can bring that seed into Champaign County and plant it, but it's not the ecosystem that we are looking for. So the Farnsworth Group's position is to work with the Forest Preserve and to see that the planting is appropriate, it's planted at the right time of the year, that the soil is rolled at the right time so that prairie seed can survive in a hard surface, and the weeds that love to have rich soil, nicely disturbed and moist, and to grow weeds. So these plants that are being planted have deep roots. They're perennial. The base grows before the upper part of the plant. So the Farnsworth Group is there to supervise. And David mentioned Jonathan, I think.
Hasselbring?
Hasselbring. And he is there as a planner to work with the Farnsworth Group. I sat next to someone who was, I thought, a farmer, and I congratulated him for having asked a question when many people didn't ask a question. And I started to talk about the bridge across the Vermilion, and I noticed that some of the steel that belongs to the bridge has disappeared. Then I made a comment that at the other end of Gray's Crossing, which is the little town just to the west of the bridge in Vermilion County, that there were Christmas trees on the railroad right-of-way. And the gentleman said, well, that's me. So he was there to see how his territory interacted with the railbed. And that was quite friendly. We've known each other for 30 years, but long enough ago that I didn't quite recognize in the dark who I was talking to. But that was the purpose of the meeting, was to have that sort of person to be interacting. I think that they brought pictures, and we've been doing things like flybys with satellite views so that you can get an idea what this trail is about. It's not easy to go to one particular part of the trail and realize that this is part of a dream between Danville, Champaign-Urbana, Monticello, Decatur, and then go north to Clinton, and Clinton to Whiteheath and back into Champaign. So there's an area there that we would like to see trails on. And so the plans for this, just this 6 miles from Urbana to St. Joe, include a bridge. And we have to realize that there's a lot of work in there. The plan is about 2 feet long by about 10 inches high and about 200 pages, so it's about an inch thick. So this is the sort of plan that a contractor has to relate to. And if they take out a tree by mistake, then the tree has to be replaced. But the Farnsworth group would say perhaps that tree has to be replaced by mitigation. Mitigation says that this tree may be worth $1,000, so then we give you $1,000 worth of prairie restoration somewhere along where it's needed. So the Farnsworth group is about to supervise that interaction. I've got about 5 minutes. We came back from that, and I found a newspaper article which said that we're about to lose a trail south of here. There was a line that closed out between Paris, Illinois, and Decatur, Illinois. It went through Bronson and through Arcola to Lake City to Decatur. And in its wisdom, the Department of Natural Resources bought most of that, but they bought it so slowly that already 11 sites had been taken by local farmers, and there's a lot of opposition there. But it's perhaps 50 miles in total. The Department of Natural Resources didn't take over more than about 2/3 of it between Lovington and Oakland. And that includes bridges and right away. But this was before there was an interim trail use agreement and a rail banking act. So the governor, in his wisdom, has decided that this trail should go back to farmers, and then I personally, as a person that's involved with prairie preservation, will say that 100 feet wide trail across there will take out a large proportion of the only natural prairie soil we have left in east central Illinois. So for me, that's a sad situation, and I'm watching it, but I think we're likely to lose that opportunity that we had. And it's been sitting there for a long time, and partially because we don't have the more recent Rail Banking Act that has allowed us to take over the Conrail line from Urbana to Danville, which is called the Kickapoo Trail. So I think we are getting toward the end of our program. So think about the loss of that land between Lovington and Oakland, and think about the loss of the vegetation that will be along that line. Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. Stay tuned, because there are quite a few things we have not yet talked about. Both the piece that Dave brought up right at the end of the show, they were talking about the Department of Natural Resources and the trail that was supposed to go through, but because they're not as diligent as Dave himself was when he was making his own arrangements, the state is in a bit of a pickle in more ways than one. So there's more of, I think, of that I'd like to ask Dave about next week, and we're down to just a minute and a half. I'm certainly not going to start that discussion, but there are also several things we haven't talked about the Kickapoo Trail. I'm really impressed with some of the things that they're doing, even if they're not going to make it really nice and pretty and smooth the way Dave would have liked it to be. There are some wonderful details that they built into it that we haven't been able to touch on, and so I don't know if it'll be already next week, but stay tuned. Don't change that dial, because I will make sure that we come back and touch some more on trails throughout east central Illinois. Having said that, it is a minute before the top of the hour, and I do need to point out to you that the views and opinions expressed are solely those of the speakers, do not necessarily represent those of anybody else. They're strictly our thoughts here at WEFT.